been here as pastor. And it is a great story, but it's a great story that's filled with conflict. It's a conflict that's not, I don't want to look at it from a doctrinal sense, but just a relational sense for a moment. You know, here you had Jesus, a Jewish man, and you had this woman that was a Samaritan. And we've talked about this before, about the conflict between a Jew and a Samaritan. Now, it was about, the whole Palestine area is about 120 miles from north to south. Jesus was in the Judean, the southern area. He wanted to go to Galilee, which was up north, several, 100 miles or so. And that was a 3-day journey. And you had two options. Option number one was taking the direct route, and option number two was to skirt around it to the east. Much like if you were a Duck fan and you wanted to go to Portland and you thought, okay, the easiest way is go straight up I-5. However, what do you pass? Beavers fans. Not a good thing. And so because you were such an ardent Duck fan, you decided to go skirt all the way around and over to Sisters Bend, down Mount Hood, and come to greener pastures up to Portland. Well, that's kind of what it was for a Jewish person, because they did not want to go through Samaria. And you say, why? Because there was a tremendous disconnect between a Samaritan and a Jew. Well, one of the things is that the Samaritans, they started from a Jewish tradition, and then over time they intermarried, and they went and they began to maybe look at other religions and other places of faith. Now, because of that, they were not allowed to come into Zion or Jerusalem and worship, and so they set up their own place, Mount Gerizim, that was in Samaria, the in-between spot. And with that, they still worshiped God, but yet it was such a cultural shift with these people that they just didn't see eye to eye. And it was such an issue that once a Samaritan person saw a Jew, man, the warning flags go up. Because immediately you identify that person as very staunch and not accepting. And then from a Jew, you looked at the Samaritan and you were saying, I don't want to go through that land. It's worthwhile for me to skirt way around and not having to go through this area. Because they just didn't see eye to eye. And Jesus addressed it. Because he says, one day we will worship not upon this mountain or that mountain. We will worship in spirit and in truth. Last week, Kim and I had the opportunity, the privilege of going out to visit our sons in South Dakota. And it was a great experience. I haven't seen sunrises and sunsets like that since I've been out in the Midwest, because there's nothing to obscure your view except another silo or a farm. But we had a great time. Well, it just happened to be when we took our flight from here to Denver to Sioux Falls, South Dakota. We were in the back of the plane, and Kim and I were talking, and this guy sat next to us. And he was very talkative, and I've been known to talk a little bit before in my life. And so we struck up a conversation. He was into selling data products to other companies, and he travels a lot and whatnot. And so our conversation kind of ebbed a little bit, and I thought, I'm gonna open up my laptop. So I sat at Kim's here, and I'm here, and this gentleman's right here. So I opened up my laptop and turned it on, And it was night, it was dark outside, and immediately the guy says, well, you know I'm going to be looking over your shoulder now. And I'm going, that's fine, I've got nothing to hide. And without just a second later, he goes, are you a pastor? And I said, guilty as charged. And he goes, sermon notes, what's that all about? Well, come to find out, he was a Christian. And he attended faithfully to a particular church. And so we talked and went on and on and on about our denomination, his denomination. And then, lo and behold, what does he bring up? The same issue that we're dealing with today. And we openly talked about it. We disagreed on some issues and whatnot. But it was interesting because we went through this hour-and-a-half trip talking about our churches and some of the issues, some of the struggles. And I said, well, our church is presently in a little bit of being uncomfortable because we're talking about this issue. And how do we, when we have people that look at it from different perspectives, how do we come to be the body of Christ? And we didn't really figure out a good thing other than to love each other. And, this is the story or the challenge of the church today. No one's exempt from having disagreements on issues. But how do we deal with it? Sometimes, frankly, we do a rotten job. And we alienate people. And we become very defensive. Both sides. And everybody in between. So what do we do? Here was the thing I think we take from this text is that Jesus, in his culture, growing up as a Jew, a Samaritan would look at him and immediately saying, oh, you're not going to like me. You're not going to accept me. You're going to think bad about me. But is that how Jesus acted? No. He loved and he accepted. Not that he always agreed, but he loved the person. And you had the Samaritan woman that saw this guy of saying, well, this guy's not even supposed to talk to a woman. And he's not even supposed to be in our neck of the woods. But I think we can learn something from Jesus in how he postured himself. He was a person that was always there to break down barriers. Because his biggest concern is that people came to trust in him. And sometimes we trust in other things. And so we're going to look at this story and we're going to look at this situation on how we posture ourselves as we face disagreements and difficult situations. One of the things I learned, one of my favorite classes when I was a freshman in college was Communication 201. It was nonverbal communication, and I learned a lot. Well, I learned a lot because I remember when we came to midterms, and I had 3 tests that week, and I got my results on Friday, and I did well on my calculus class, and I did really well on my sociology test. And I thought, man, I'll be like AAA. And I was all excited. And then I got my test from nonverbal communication. You kind of laugh because what do I do today? Communicate. I flunked the test. I learned a couple things from that class that I didn't know at all. And then I learned another thing is how we communicate sometimes we don't even realize. People will see us by the way we look, the stance we take, the posture we take, and they will make judgment calls, sometimes before we even open up our mouth. Let me tell you a story. When our kids were in high school, Kim attended a parent-teacher conference. And I won't say what kid it is. You could probably guess. But anyway, so Kim went. I wasn't there. So Kim went by herself and went to meet with this teacher. It was a math teacher. And so she came into the room, and the teacher was behind the desk and just, nice and very professional and looked great. And Kim says, "Man, I'm so anxious because we're new up in this area up in Mount Hood area." And so she was very anxious to hear about how the kids are doing in school. Well, she introduced herself as Kim Nylund, and the teacher went and looked at her roll and saw who she was associated with, and immediately, no joke, went just like this. What does that tell you? Not only did she not like her kid, or maybe that kid was goofing up or something, but she was closed. Kim tried that whole conference time to try to break into that barrier, and she never did. Sometimes we don't even realize what we portray to the person we have conflict with. It could be about this issue, it could be about any issue. But we don't realize. Sometimes we come at it and we think that we're justified. Well, maybe you are. But it doesn't come without conflict. Sometimes you're not justified. Sometimes it's just in your own head. But that's just who we are. Remember, two people are going to have three different opinions. That was a real blessed thing about Jesus. Because he didn't come into it and say, well, I disagree with you on this issue or that issue. He came in and he says, I want a relationship. I want a relationship with you. And he didn't talk about doctrine, but he had a posture of being loving and welcoming. Even though maybe she didn't, and she was scared. And she knew in history how other people had treated her. I mean, she came to the well, Jacob's well, which is probably about a half a mile out of the town of Sychar, which we assume that's where she lived. That was a half a mile. There was closer places to get water. Why did she go to this one? Why did she go to the one in the middle of the day and the heat of the day? Why did she go there when she is alone? It's not safe to travel out there. It must have been because, well, she'd been hurt. To take the posture of Jesus in any conversation is a posture of love. And it's also a posture that doesn't happen all the time with just our attempts to make it right. Sometimes we need to acknowledge that we haven't taken the correct posture. Sometimes we need to acknowledge that we haven't done things right. Sometimes we have to acknowledge that we've been a little forceful in certain areas. But the only way that we can, I believe, not only through our own acknowledgement, but it comes to confessing it and asking God for strength.
Talking as a staff and praying, we've been talking about how there is a difference between a position, which is a space, and a posture, which is how you hold that space. And so today, as a church, we are talking not about a position. You can stand in a space and you can stand there with your back to others. You can stand there in pride. Or you can stand, like Pastor Bill said, in love and in openness and in welcome. So as we talk about different postures that we can take as a church, we need to recognize that in all hard conversations, but especially in this one, we need to embrace a posture of coming before the Lord in prayer. And when we do that, when we come before the Lord in prayer, we are embracing a posture of humility, a posture that says, I'm kneeling before you, God, because I know I don't have all the answers. I don't know how it should all be. That as faithfully as I try and interpret your scripture, I'm sure that there are places that I've gotten it wrong. And so we start in a position of humility, also recognizing that all of humanity stands before God on the same plane. All of us are not good enough. All of us are guilty in our sin. And all of us are loved. All of us have the freedom to be cleansed through Jesus and to have his righteousness be what makes us right, not our own righteousness. So at the prayer bench, we have a posture of humility, but we also have a posture of confession. We have a posture of confession because our words and actions have caused unnecessary hurt to people. Now, we all can conjure up images in our mind of people who wave banners and signs and say hateful things. And we look at those people, most of us, I would assume, and we think that that's repugnant. But if I'm honest in a posture of confession, I know that there are times that I have made comments or jokes or used words that demeaned my brothers and sisters who are made in the image of God. And as a church, we have space to confess together that our churches, the sanctuaries where people are meant to commune with God, have often been an unsafe place for our brothers and sisters to talk about the struggles that they are facing. And instead of being connected with God, they have at times felt that there is a barrier placed between them and God. Statistically speaking, sexual minorities, in particular youth, since I work with youth who identify as part of the LGBTQIA plus community, have a much, much higher rate of depression, have a much, much higher chance of attempting, considering, or actually taking their own lives. Statistically speaking, young people who are part of the LGBT community are more likely to be kicked out of their homes, rejected by their parents and their communities, and to end up on the street or couch surfing with friends. Sometimes we need to confess the words and actions we have done, and sometimes we need to confess the words we did not say and the actions we did not take, the way that we have been complicit in a community, in a church community that has not been a safe place for people to be honest about what they're facing. The prayer bench is a posture of humility and a posture of confession, but it's also a posture of grief. It's a posture of grief because even if we love as freely and wholly as we are able, we acknowledge that by virtue of the position that our church and our denomination holds, those who are at disagreement with us, those who are sexual minorities, are going to feel hurt by our position. And that doesn't mean that we have to change our position, but that we can grieve together the pain that is caused. And if you, brothers and sisters, have never had the opportunity to sit with, to be friends with a person who is a sexual minority, I would encourage you to find a way to build relationships, to get to know people, because if you hear someone's story, You can't help but grieving the pain that they have experienced. I have heard a lot of stories. I've read a lot of stories. I've sat with a lot of people and cried with them. Imagine what it would be like to be a young person who grows up in the church, hearing the church's position, hearing comments from people that don't realize that that young person has these desires for people of the same sex, attraction to somebody of the same sex. Those are not desires that are usually chosen. People don't choose who they're attracted to any more than you choose who you're attracted to. And so if you grow up in the church and you have these feelings, you experience terror. You experience self-loathing. You experience fear that your family, that God might reject you. When you hear the stories of these beautiful, beautiful brothers and sisters made in God's image, you can't help but have a posture of grief, of lament that says, Father, why? Why is the burden that some have to carry so heavy? And how can I help carry that burden? When we're at the prayer bench, we also take a posture of love, a posture of asking God to give us his eyes and his heart for the people around us in the world, to see others the way that he sees them and to love them as holy as he loves them. And we also take a posture of discernment, a posture where we're asking God to guide us, to give us wisdom and help us know how to best follow Jesus' example in a world where things are really gray and we want to do what's right and we want to treat people well, but we know that we're going to falter at times. And so we say, Lord, guide us, guide our steps. Help us to follow Jesus' example. It's a posture of discernment because we need to know when to speak and when to listen. Many of you are married or have been married. Many of you, maybe who have not been married, have had a close friendship. If you have a disagreement with your spouse, if you see something differently, if you disagree with a choice they made or a way they're handling something, it is not that important that every interaction that you have with them be prefaced with you making sure you declare your disagreement. It's okay for you to have moments where you have those loving conversations where you say, hey, honey, I'm worried about the way this is being handled. I'm worried. But you know what it would be like if every conversation, if every activity you did, you needed to start it with, well, I don't agree with the way you handled X, Y, Z, but we need discernment to know when God is calling us to have conversations and when God is calling us to listen and to love and to encourage. And we need to pray for discernment, that we would be able to know that we can entrust our brothers and sisters to God because they're his servants. So we take a posture of prayer first and foremost. But we move from that posture of prayer because just staying in our hearts and in our conversation with God, having a posture of humility, of confession, of grief, of love and discernment isn't enough. We also need to be prepared to step into a posture of welcome, a posture of love. And in this love seat, we recognize three things. When you sit in a love seat with somebody, you're pretty close to them. It's not like a sofa with an empty cushion in between. You're brushing elbows. You're brushing shoulders. When we sit in a love seat, we are present with each other. We're following Jesus' example of presence. Jesus, the one who wanted to sit down and speak with the Samaritan woman at the well. Jesus, the one who was judged because he hung out with people that the religious leaders thought were not holy enough to be around him. But Jesus said, hey, I came to love sinners who will know they need me, not those who think they're too good for me, right? When we are present with people and following Jesus' example of presence, we recognize who he was gentle with. Jesus did not tell Zacchaeus, once you've repaid everything you've stolen, then I'll come to your house. Jesus started with relationship, and then as Zacchaeus experienced his love, then Zacchaeus began to say, how can I be a disciple? What must I do? And he decided to pay back what he had stolen. Jesus was gentle, so gentle, with people that the world thought were dirty or repugnant or sinful or looked down on. The people Jesus was harsh with, were the religious leaders who thought that they deserved a special presence before God because of following the rules. The people Jesus was harsh with were the people that he said, woe to you, Pharisees, because you tie up heavy burdens and place them on men's backs, but you yourself are not willing to lift a finger to help them carry it. When we are present with people like Jesus, we do not worry about what people think about us or who we are loving and walking alongside. We worry about being present and being in relationship. We listen to one another. We love one another. When we are in the love seat, we are present, but we are sitting alongside someone. We're not standing above, shaking a finger. We're sitting alongside, recognizing that before God, we are all at the same level. We are sitting alongside in loving relationship, carrying each other's burdens. We are sitting alongside listening to stories, listening to the things that are hard, listening to the joys that we experience, celebrating together, crying together. When we sit alongside, we recognize that we not only give to the person we sit next to, but we receive from them. A part of the story of the woman at the well that is so amazing to me is that Jesus doesn't just welcome her, Jesus uses her. He says to her, go back, tell your family, and she goes, and if you look at the narrative, it says that many people believed in Jesus because of her testimony. When we sit alongside people, we recognize that God can work through all of us despite our failures, and that God will choose to use us if we surrender ourselves to him. And so we sit alongside and we say, I'm going to give to my friend, to my neighbor, and I'm also going to recognize that they have gifts to give to me, that they are worthy as God's children of sharing truth with me, of sharing love with me, of being there for me as well. In the love seat, we're present, we sit alongside, and we are family. We don't stand here and talk about us and them. We recognize that together it is we. That when one of us is hurting, it's our family that's hurting. That when one of us is rejoicing, it's our family that's rejoicing. We are family together. We face our hardships together. We listen, we love, we laugh, we cry, we enjoy the gifts that God has given us together. And when we are family, we commit to love one another and to be present with one another, even if we don't agree with each other's perspectives or actions, because we can all hold our positions as long as we do it with a posture of love.
This happens to be one of my most, probably Kim's too, one of my most treasured pieces of furniture in our house. On May 16th, 1985, Kim and I were sitting at this exact pew. This pew came from the church that I grew up in. On February 25th, 1985, I think I've told you a number of times before, I was playing basketball and I injured myself and I ruptured a disc in my back. On treatment and wasn't doing the stuff, and it was finally diagnosed it was a ruptured disc, and scared me to death. My dad had a fused back, and I know what he went through. And on May 16th, our pastor, Mark Miller, had a prayer service for healing at the small church that I grew up in Bremerton, First Covenant, now called Grace Covenant. And I remember walking in, and I'm 6'5", but when I was walking into that worship service, I was about 5'10" because I was hunched over because of the pain. You've had back problems. Couldn't stand up straight. It's constant pain, and I was all hunched over. And I came into the service and sat down, and immediately I felt one of the most overwhelming experiences that I've ever felt in my entire life. And I went to Kim, and she was sitting right next to me, and I said, I'm not going to make it. Meaning that it wasn't that I was going to fall over dead right there, but I'm not going to make it because something was happening. I had the deepest, the elders were up front, and they were inviting people to come up. We were singing some songs, and the elders would lay hands and anoint with oil for prayer of healing. But as I'm sitting in this pew, I just felt like there was a warm pack, a heating pad, right on my injured place of my back. I wish Leonard could be up here and feel the same thing. And it was overwhelming, and I'm sitting there, and I'm falling apart, believe it or not, in the pew there, and God healed me right there. My staff is behind there. I brought it up with me today. And this is the staff that I took when we went on our sabbatical, of those major God moments when God showed his face and his power in phenomenal ways that I cannot deny. I went ahead and went up and kneeled in front of the elders, and they laid hands on me, but I was already healed. I figured it was more for them than it was for me because God had already touched me. It was right here in the pew from the church that I grew up in. We sit here today not in just a posture of love, a posture that we open ourselves up to people that think differently than we do. We come into a posture of prayer like Kristi had portrayed, for grief and for love and for confession. We come into a posture of love and a love seat and just embrace one another. But ultimately we come into a posture of worship and ministry. And that's God's church. If I would write history, I would write it this way. I would love for Milwaukie Covenant Church to be that shining light, some of the church that has struggled with this issue and disagreements on human sexuality and whatnot. And I wish that, I'm just dreaming this stuff, I guess, and thinking that people would say, well, how did you work through this? And I would have to say it was only by the grace of God. I don't know what the future holds for, be it our denomination, for our church, for each of us. But I know, being kingdom-minded, God has got good stuff in store. We read the story, Greg read the story of the Samaritan woman and Jesus, and they thought differently. And they came in with anxiety and stress and hurt and emotion. And it played out initially with the relationship between Jesus and the woman. The woman says, well, why in the world do you ask me? We don't do this. And the word that's used there, it says, we don't share from the same table. We don't share utensils. And because we just don't, the Jews and the Samaritans just didn't see eye to eye. Well, what did Jesus do there? He said, phooey. He says, I need your help. I need to drink from this water. I'm thirsty. I'm tired. The well's 100 feet deep. I didn't have the equipment, and I need your help. And you know, that's ministry. But at the end of that passage that Kristi alluded to, which I want to close this with, and it says, after Jesus had that relationship with the Samaritan woman, and she went back to town and says, hey, you never guess what happened. It says this in verse 39. Many of the Samaritans from the town believed in him because of the woman's testimony. He told me everything I ever did. So when the Samaritans came to him, they urged him to stay with them, and he stayed a few days. And because his words, many more became believers. They said to the woman, we no longer believe just because of what you said. Now we have heard ourselves that we know that this man really is the Savior of the world. You know, ultimately it comes down to it comes down ultimately not just to the relationships that we need to put back together, and we need to all work on that. But it comes down to ministry. Because the Samaritans believed in God, Jews believed in God, and they came together in the relationship of these two individuals, Jesus and the Samaritan woman. They blended in such a way that it says, many people believed. Man, I hope that's our story. But I hope our story is one of posturing ourselves with love, with acceptance, grieving, as Paul says in Romans, we mourn with those who are mourning, and we rejoice with those who are rejoicing. I pray God's blessing upon every one of you. I've said it before, I'll say it again. I love you. I think you probably know that. And I just pray that God leads us into an area of loving each other and joining together in ministry in such a way that many more will believe.